Now to our station let us march and rendezvous with pleasure. We have been like brave Minutemen to serve so great a treasure. We let them see immediately that we are men of metal. We Jersey boys that fear no noise will never flinch for battle.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Linda Spear. I'm the director and administrator here at ArtSpace, and, well, chief cook, bottle washer, toilet fixer, you name it here. I'd like to welcome all of you to tonight's presentation and tell you a little bit about ArtSpace itself. Founded in 2001, this nonprofit organization is based itself on a few tenets. The first being we provide affordable studio space to 80 artists here with 45 studios. We have a very long wait list. We're pretty popular, pretty vibrant and dynamic environment here. Our second tenet is that we also exhibit the works of established and emerging contemporary artists here. As you can see, we have one of our artists here this evening, Kay Hartung, who has done the encaustics here. As well as Michelle Luigi, who did, as many of you asked, yes, they were the garbage bag ones that they were talking about, exhibits as well. So that's another one of our tenets that we do. And the third is, of course, is participation in community efforts such as tonight. ArtSpace has a variety of services that we have here. We not only have the artist studios, the gallery, we have a kiln, we have print press capabilities, and we have Acme Theater, a really well-known community theater. It's nationally known because they've won some legacy awards as well. So this is really a vibrant place, and we really love it here, and we really welcome all of you. Keep in mind a few other things. We also have what we refer to as opening receptions periodically throughout the year. We're dark during the summer, but we're being open back again in the end of September, September 29 and 30. Mark your calendars. That's our open studios time, where all of the artists have their studios open. And you can come and see their works, perhaps make a few purchases, and generally enjoy the environment itself. Then the beginning of December, we have in November 30th, December 1st and 2nd this year is our annual holiday sale. And this is where all 3 floors are open with many of our artists from here showing and selling some of their works, as well as outside artists from our community as well. And then in January, we're also going to have another show called Only from Maynard. And this is going to be exhibiting artists who live in this area, in Maynard. So it's a great place. Welcome, and thank you all for coming, and thank you.
All right.
Jim Moran, the Vice President of the American Antiquarian Society.
So thank you all for coming. As Linda said, my name is Jim Moran. I'm Vice President for Programs and Outreach at the American Antiquarian Society. We are a national research library and a learned society dedicated to pre-20th century American history, and we're located in Worcester, Massachusetts. And we are delighted to join Freedom's Way National Heritage area in presenting this program, Declaring Independence Then and Now. This is part of a program of 10 other performances that are happening around the state. Culminating, midway through, there will be a panel presentation at the Antiquarian Society where Peter Onuf, David Blight, and Annette Gordon-Reed will talk about the declaration as it was conceived and then reappropriated over the years to our current time. And there are more about this on this postcard, which is available as you leave. Before we go any further, I need to beg of you that you turn off any 21st century devices that will impede your journey back to 1776. I want to just say a little bit about how this project got started, because it really is...
Interesting question.
Yes, it is. It's a very interesting question. As I mentioned, we are, the American Antiquarian Society is a national research library. We hold our mission is to collect, preserve, and make available for study the printed record of this country before 1876. We hold 2/3 of everything printed before 1820. That is the largest collection of that material anywhere in the world. It rivals that of the Library of Congress. It rivals any other repository anywhere. And within our collection is a broadside of the Declaration of Independence. A broadside is anything printed on one side. And this is a fairly large broadside with the standard declaration printed on it. It was printed in the summer of 1776 by Ezekiel Russell in the town of Salem, Massachusetts. But what makes this such an interesting piece is that at the bottom of the declaration of the piece is the instructions to every pastor and clergy member in each town in Massachusetts to read this document from their pulpit on the Sunday after they receive it. And further, it is to intones that it should then be written into the town records as a memorial thereof. This is also cited in the script that you will hear in a few moments. Our particular document, our artifact, which is very rare, there's only about half a dozen of these still in existence, but ours came to us with a handwritten note from the town clerk of the town of Charlton, saying that the good Reverend Ezekiel Russell did read this, not Ezekiel Russell, Caleb Curtis did read this on such and such a date, and it was recorded in the town. Now, I live in the town of Charlton, and that church that Caleb Curtis ministered over was the first or original church in Charlton, and I am a member of that church. I'm, in fact, the moderator of that church. So I have a real personal connection to this document in some ways. I shared this document at a planning meeting of Freedom's Way several years ago, and it got us to thinking about what was going on in 1776 in the towns around Massachusetts. Did they indeed read this document as they were told to do so? Did they believe in it? Were they opposed to it? And how did they get to the point where they were declaring independence? And that's essentially what this evening is about. You're about to hear a Reader's Theater presentation written by Mary Fuhrer, who is a local public historian. She is going to share with you some of the early debates that occurred in your communities to whether we should declare independence or not, because the towns all made resolves and sent them to Philadelphia. And then we're going to talk about the Declaration itself. We will end our reading with a discussion, a question and answer, free-form discussion based upon the questions that are on this document, this brochure that is on your seat. So we want you to be thinking about these questions about the relevancy of this document, this seminal document in American history, and whether we're really fulfilling the themes in it or not. And at the very end, after our Q&A is finished, we're going to sing another song, and we're going to sing it to the words that are written on the chair next to you as well. So that's the format of this evening. And now I'd like to introduce you to our cast. This evening's program will be narrated by Ben Atherton Zeman. Then we will hear from Betsy Cutler, Hal Cutler, Christopher Hurley, Claire Hurley, and Darlene Wigman. And now, declaring independence then and now in Maynard. Jim.
The Declaration of Independence is revolutionary. It was in 1776, and it remains so today, as it boldly professes what is and what could be. This declaration announced the birth of a nation, one governed by and for the people, in order to secure liberty, equality, and justice for all. For over 200 years, we have been engaged in a struggle to redeem these revolutionary promises. And today, the Declaration remains a remarkable document of what we as a nation must continually strive to become. Now, many played a part in birthing the Declaration, as Jim said in his introduction. And in the spring of 1776, when the Continental Congress was considering independence from Great Britain, it wanted assurances from each colony that they would support this risky endeavor. And the colonies responded with the language of independence, language they had heard over the previous 10 years of popular protests. And in Massachusetts, John Adams and the legislature put the matter directly to the towns.
Essex Journal, May 18th, 1776. Resolved as the opinion of this House that the inhabitants of each town in this colony ought, in full meeting, advise whether that if the Honorable Congress should, for the safety of said colonies, declare them independent of the Kingdom of Great Britain, they, said inhabitants, will solemnly engage with their lives and fortunes to support this measure.
So across Massachusetts, people gathered in their town meetings, as we shall be in Maynard on Monday, but it was to debate this particular question. And each knew the meaning of engaging with their lives and fortunes. If they tried and failed to separate from Britain, they would face the penalties of treason. Their properties seized, their lives forfeited. Today, the results of their debates and votes survive in town meeting record books. Some towns simply affirmed their support. Others drafted full-fledged town declarations of independence. And some, like Barnstable, whose coastline lay exposed to the world's most powerful navy, voted not to seek independence. But let us recover some of the words of our local townsfolk in 1776.
Lexington, Town Meeting, May 20, 1776. If Congress should, for the safety of the colonies, declare them independent of the Kingdom of Great Britain, we stand ready with our lives and fortunes to support them in the measures.
Acton, June ye 14th, 1776, at a general town meeting. The subverting of our Constitution, the many injuries and unheard of barbarities which these colonies have received from Great Britain confirms us in the opinion that the present age would be deficient in our duty to God, their posterity, and themselves if they do not establish an American republic. We give them the strongest assurance that if they should declare America to be a free and independent republic, we will support and defend the measure with our lives and fortune.
Westford Town Meeting, June 14th, 1776. It is our humble opinion that nothing short of a state of independency will so well answer for our safety, and in case Congress should declare a state of independency, we will acquiesce thereto and risk our lives and fortunes in support thereof.
Go Westford, go Acton, go Lexington. Now, what did we do? In 1776, Maynard was a part of Stowe and of Sudbury. So how did our townsmen respond?
A month later, Stowe Town Meeting, July 1st, 1776. On the second article in the warrant relative to independency, voted as the opinion of this town that a government independent of Great Britain might be formed if the government of this colony and the Continental Congress shall think such a measure expedient.
Sudbury Town Meeting, June 10th, 1776. The present unhappy situation of our public affairs by reason of the arbitrary and oppressive measures taken against us in the American colonies by the King and Parliament of Great Britain and all hopes of an accommodation seems to be finally at an end. We, therefore, give the strongest assurance that it is not only the unanimous but the hearty and sincere intention of your constituents that the Honorable Continental Congress, for the safety of these colonies, declare them independent of Great Britain. They will, at the risk of their all, support them in such a measure.
Hear, hear.
Here, here.
Here.
Now, more than 3/4 of Massachusetts towns drafted statements on independence that spring, and almost all of them were positive. Crafting, debating, and voting on these statements solidified support and mobilized towns. It primed the people for the Declaration of Independence. So if you missed town meeting on Monday, you could miss something big. Now, when the Continental Congress ultimately declared independence, word traveled fast. And by fast, I mean it took 10 days. And by July 14th, an express rider carrying the declaration reached Worcester, where Isaiah Thomas waylaid him. This activist printer took the document to the steps of the meeting house and proclaimed it. Pardon me. Is that right?
Yep.
Oh, it is. Okay. All right, so he took the document to the steps of the meeting house in Worcester and proclaimed it to the assembled crowds before allowing the rider to carry on to Boston. And this marked the first time those memorable words were heard in Massachusetts. Public celebrations ensued.
Massachusetts Spy, Worcester, July 24th. On Monday last, a number of patriotic gentlemen of this town assembled on the green near the Liberty Pole, where the bells were set a-ringing and drums a-beating, after which the Declaration of Independency of the United States was read to a large and respectable body, who testified their approbation by repeated huzzahs, firing of musketry and cannon, bonfires, and other demonstrations of joy. The Sons of Freedom repaired to the tavern, where toasts were drunk, including perpetual itching without the benefit of scratching to the enemies of America.
In Boston, one of the Sons of Liberty read the Declaration from the Old State House balcony to jubilant crowds below. Then, the legislature ordered the document to be proclaimed in every village and town.
In council, July 17th, 1776, ordered that the Declaration of Independence be printed and a copy sent to the ministers of each parish within the state, and that they be required to read the same to their respective congregations, and to deliver it to the clerks of the town, who are thereby required to record the same in their town books, there to remain as a perpetual memorial thereof.
Now, when they heard that the Declaration proclaimed in their towns, July of 1776, the people recognized those words as their own. They recognized the grievances as those trials they had experienced, and the liberties asserted as their birthright. Hear that Declaration of Independence now, as it was heard proclaimed to Massachusetts townsfolk 240 years ago. I need my glasses. The Declaration begins by announcing a great change in government, and the reasons for this change must be clearly set forth for all, for colonists, for British, and the whole world to understand.
In Congress, July 4th, 1776. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
Then, in a most memorable passage, the Declaration asserts the equality and universal right to liberty of all the people, and the responsibility of government to ensure those rights. Everything else in the Declaration flows from these extraordinary claims.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
The Declaration then professes colonist respect for established laws. However, those laws have been so repeatedly violated that to continue under current government would amount to surrendering to tyranny.
Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind is more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute rule, despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, which is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government.
Now, the longest portion of the Declaration details the people's grievances, for it is these grievances that justify the overthrow of authority. This train of abuses that the king has repeatedly and purposefully harmed the colonists is the proof that he's become a tyrant, is the proof that he's no longer fit to be the guardian of their liberty and equality.
The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
So we then hear 29 general grievances against king, against parliament, and again, we're not going to do all 29, don't worry. Some of you are like, whoa. These 29 grievances are against the king, they're against parliament, and against the British people. They begin with the actions taken by the king to obstruct, delay, and negate colonial government, undermining the sovereignty of the people.
He has refused to assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them.
They protest that the king, fearing large legislative bodies, had refused to allocate representatives to the growing frontier, denying settlers their rightful voice in government.
He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only.
They protest punitive acts by king and parliament that hampered the meetings and business of colonial legislatures, again, denying the people their rightful participation in government.
He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing the manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative power, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise. The state, remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within.
All of these above grievances point to one end. The king was obstructing the rule of law in order to silence the voice and the will of the people. The list of grievances continued. The king had banned settlements in the Ohio River Valley, limiting westward migration of the colonists, and in their minds, the right to secure their subsistence on new lands. He was thus obstructing prosperity and denying their pursuit of happiness.
He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands.
The king interfered with American courts of justice and diverted them from established rule of law and the pursuit of common good.
He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries.
The king appointed despised tax collectors and customs agents to police American trade and to injure their economic well-being.
He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance.
He had sent his army to harass and intimidate them.
He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power.
He allowed Parliament to impose laws upon the colonists, though the colonies had no representation in Parliament, laws that undermined the sovereignty of the people in their colonial legislatures.
He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation.
Parliament punished their protests with a series of intolerable acts that violated their treasured rights as British citizens.
For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us, in many cases, of the benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses.
Parliament allowed French law and Catholic religion to persist in Quebec after it became an English colony. This and other acts the colonists believed threatened their prized English constitutional law and Protestant religion.
For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies.
Perhaps most grievously, the colonies believed that king and parliament together conspired to strip them of their prized right of self-government. Constitutions were voided, laws abolished, even town meetings were banned.
For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever.
I think I misspoke. I think that was all 19, wasn't it, Jim? I was incorrect. And by these abuses, I mean, it was interesting, wasn't it? There's a lot of detail there that I hadn't known. By these abuses, the king had abandoned his rule as their sovereign protector. He had become their enemy, at war with his own people.
He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation.
In that war, they also asserted that the king was impressing American sailors into the British Navy and inciting Native Americans to attack the frontiers.
He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions.
The king ignored all their appeals for justice, therefore he forfeited his place as ruler and left them a people ungoverned.
In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which must define a tyrant is unfit to be a ruler of a free people.
The British people, too, once held in warm brotherly affection, abandoned them to the abuses of king and parliament. In grief, the colonists must separate from their ancestral kin.
Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends.
Being then without a governor or government, it is necessary for these colonies to establish a new government with all the powers of governments among the nations of the world.
We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these United States are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do.
Hear, hear.
Finally, the people declare that to this new government they pledge their all, including all that will be lost if their cause fails, their lives, their property, their honor among descendants.
And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
Now these words were proclaimed out loud like this from pulpits, including Jim's own church. They were printed in broadsides, toasted in taverns. They responded to deeply felt grievances. They professed deeply held rights. They inspired people to risk their all to create a new nation a nation dedicated to liberty and equality. Now, for 240 years, we have wrestled with fulfilling the Declaration's promises of liberty, equality, and justice. The challenges are with us still to secure liberty, to ensure equality before the law, to provide the means for all to pursue their potential and their happiness. The Declaration is a living document. It draws its vitality from each generation's pursuit of liberty and equality. We have contested, does liberty apply to slaves? Does equality apply to women? Does it?
Better.
It better, she says. Is equal justice ensured among races, across religious creeds? What does equality mean in a society divided by class, divided by wealth? Does poverty jeopardize liberty? Does liberty imply essential rights to health, to education, to welfare? And when our government falls short of ensuring liberty and equality, what redress do we have for our grievances? How do we exercise it? We, here tonight, we are heirs of this obligation to redeem the promises of the Declaration of Independence. So how are we doing? Thank you.
So how are we doing?
Not good.
Not good. Why?
There you go.
There's inequality in wealth, in social structure, in housing, in education.
How does that impede freedom?
It keeps people from becoming their better selves.
Okay. Okay. Why?
Because if I can't afford to go to college because I come from a poor family and I can't make as much money as someone who can afford $50,000 a year to get a better education and a better job. So you're impeding my right and my freedom to do that.
Okay.
And if I can't feed my family and I have no housing and can't afford my health care, how do I function as a good citizen?
Let me ask you something. This program tonight is free. Why don't you think more people came?
I know one reason, there's a competing event with the Democratic Committee. Yeah, so I think there would have been more people there.
I run programs like this, lectures and performances. They're always free. I don't see people of color. I don't see people who don't have a lot of money come. Why?
They're busy trying to live their lives.
Okay,
Trying
good, yep.
to take care of their children,
Yep.
trying to take care of their health, trying to maintain their home. They're working a second job. They don't feel welcomed because of how our wider culture is. They didn't hear about it because of where it was advertised.
I think all of those are valid reasons. I'll submit one more. I think that poverty impoverishes the imagination as well, and that people don't feel like they're welcome in places like this. Yeah.
I think the privileged have the privilege and freedom to discuss privilege. They have the freedom to discuss the abstract in ways that the unprivileged don't.
Do the privileged have any obligation to help people who are less privileged?
They absolutely do. Do they always? Frequently not.
They do it if they want the best for society.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, if we have privilege, I have so much, but if we have privilege, then it's our responsibility for our brothers and sisters without privilege to make them welcome in these situations. Also, an event like this, internet access is an issue. That's how I found out about it. Not everyone has a computer, not everyone has internet. So we have to remember that and shift work.
Jen, can you talk just for a moment, about the demographics of the Sons of Liberty? So, because we're talking a bit now, so going to the theme of declaring independence then and now, and if we say that those of us who are here in this room now probably fairly fall into the category of people in our society who benefit from privilege, how representative of that, or what is the corollary, or is there a corollary of those who were actively declaring independence in the colonies? Was it demographically those who were more successful, or were those who were more successful more likely to be the loyalists because they were benefiting, or?
It's complicated. The American Revolution is one of the few revolutions where the leaders of society are still the leaders after the revolution. So it's not a social revolution in the sense that we're overthrowing the leaders and replacing them with different leaders. The people who are writing this document and the people who are debating it are of the upper class. They're very well educated. They tend to be lawyers. They tend to be clergy, and others who have access to the print culture and the ideas. However, a lot of the lawyers, particularly in Massachusetts, were loyalists, and many of them lost everything and had to go back to England. So it's not clearly, across those lines. Particularly in Massachusetts, there is a middle class that's playing a really important role between this higher echelons of people who are writing the Declaration and writing all the pamphlets. There are 240 pamphlets written at this time arguing one way or the other around independence. And then there's this middle class of people, including people like Paul Revere and my buddy Isaiah Thomas, who founded my institution. Isaiah Thomas, as you heard, read the Declaration. He was a printer. Those people translated because their businesses interacted with the wealthy. Paul Revere made silverware for wealthy people, but he was not of that class. But he also interacted with the lower classes. Those people kind of translated the ideas down to the people who are actually going to be the grunts in the field. Particularly in this state, or this colony, everybody became outraged over one of the intolerable acts. I mean, all of the intolerable acts they hated, but the Massachusetts Government Act was the one that impacted everybody. And that essentially stripped us of our town meetings, of our local governments, and replaced the British governor, Thomas Gage, became essentially a military leader. That's the reference to that in the that's what that's in reference to. And it made the revolution in Massachusetts extremely popular. There's a historian, Ray Raphael, who claims it could be as much as 90% of the free white men who are the political powers, but chances are their women are also with them. Their first act of rebellion is to close the courts all throughout the rural parts of Massachusetts. And in Worcester, over 5,000 militiamen come to close the courts. It's a lot of people. They're coming from 37 different communities, and many of them are coming from they would need to travel over at least 2 days to get there. They're doing this in September. Now that doesn't mean much to us, but September is when they're harvesting. Right. This is a time when you're not normally going to leave your farm. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
The interior of Massachusetts and most of Connecticut and Rhode Island was the most unanimously in favor of the part of the 13 colonies that was strongest for independence.
Right.
Anywhere further west, New York, Pennsylvania, or further south, there's more of a split.
Yep.
And there's a substantial number of people that left with the British troops when they evacuated Boston on St. Patrick's Day in 1776. And the philosophical part of the Declaration of Independence was essentially not new. Practically everybody in Britain that was interested in politics believed that from the time of the Glorious Revolution in 1689. And Jefferson is largely paraphrasing John Locke as far as that goes. Whether the various acts that the King and Parliament were charged with in the Declaration amounted to an attempt to set up absolute tyranny, that was controversial among many people who shared the philosophic basis of the Declaration, including the notion of God-given inalienable rights. And there's sincere debate about that. This doesn't all happen suddenly, and there are changes very late. At the time that King George took the throne, there was a statue that was gilded, set up for him in New York City. That got melted down later to make cannons. But King George had been very popular as of 1760, and you find nobody talking about independence until long after that. There were 2 colonies only that were fully self-governing, as self-governing as any place on earth, choosing their own governors. Those at the very head of the government. That's Connecticut and Rhode Island. Massachusetts had that only up till the 1790s, when it became a royal colony. Most colonies were 1690s, right? Most colonies were royal colonies. Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware had proprietors that appointed the governor. So yes, it is complicated.
Your comments about New England being a hotbed of the Revolution is confirmed if you go down to Williamsburg and listen to one of the interpreters who will tell you that it's those hotheads up in Massachusetts, in Boston, that are causing all these problems. They were very content down there. But I think in response to your comment about who the spearheads were, I think it's very meaningful that they asked for the support of all the towns through their town meetings, as we've heard tonight, in the words of the town meeting. And Sudbury was a farming community in 1775, the largest farming community, largest community away from the coast. And its people obviously supported this. 305 of its men came out on April 19, 1775, to participate in the battle against the Redcoats, British regulars. So this was definitely an area that was in the middle of it.
I knew so little of this before this. I'm just so excited that I was asked to do this narration. Back to why there are fewer people of color here. Seriously, in the Declaration it says the merciless Indian savages? I mean, my goodness.
At least they get mentioned. Enslaved people are not even mentioned.
Well, it's clear that it's not. I mean, white males are not mentioned either, but by the absence of mentioning, it's sort of the I, that's we the people is the people that look like me. And yeah, this was 240 years ago, but as it is a living document, as we have the responsibility to wrestle with it, I'm going to wrestle with this. In one of our founding documents, it says merciless Indian savages. Too bad you can't amend it like the Constitution. Write an amendment to the Declaration.
Yes, sir.
Well, in fact, it is a Declaration of Independence, but it has no force of law. I mean, the Constitution has the force of law, and the amendments and acts of Congress after the establishment as the force of law, but does the Declaration of Independence have the force of law? It has moral force, but does it have legal force?
Yes, they're in a state of nature when they're writing this. So it's an interesting point. Yeah.
One question. At this time, what was the balance of power between the monarch, between King George and the Parliament? Because there's discussion of the power of the Parliament, but it was very clearly a monarchy.
Most of the arguments for the protests before this document are aimed at Parliament. We viewed that Parliament was a separate entity from King George, and it was not doing what King George wanted.
If I may,
sure.
To speak out against the king could be treason. Mm-hmm. And so it was safe to speak out against Parliament.
True.
Mm-hmm. King George was much more active in politics than his two predecessors. He was the first in his dynasty who was raised in Britain and really was British. His George I had been brought in as the closest Protestant relative to Queen Anne after she died, having given birth to numerous children, all of whom died before she did. He was thoroughly German. The old story was that he and his cabinet had to speak Latin together. That's wrong. They spoke French. His successor, George II, spent much of his time fighting in Germany at the head of his army. He was the last British monarch actually to fight in battles, as William of Orange, when he took over in the Glorious Revolution, most assuredly did. He was a Dutchman. George III, when he took the throne, and said, "Raised in this realm, I glory in the name of Britain," and all that, and that added to the popularity. His mother told him, "George be a king." And to the extent of his rather limited intellect, he tried to do that. And he played favorites in Parliament, and there's no question. And he certainly, when push came to shove, ready to back certain people in Parliament and his cabinet in clamping down on Massachusetts, particularly after the Boston Tea Party. And things deteriorated fast after that. This was all before he went mad. That came later. But,
yes.
Yeah, I was just curious why it sounded as if Massachusetts was singled out to have a tyrant running a military dictatorship sort of. What was that?
Because of the Boston Tea Party. I mean, they really are outraged by that act, and the intolerable acts, or the coercive acts, as they referred to them, were all aimed at bringing Massachusetts under control.
There were equivalents in other colonies, notably in Pennsylvania and in Rhode Island, in react to the Tea Act that was essentially meant to bribe Americans into starting to import British goods again that they had been boycotting, and thereby acknowledging Parliament's power to tax. But the opposition in Boston had been most conspicuous.
Did they ask other towns and other colonies to draft similar pro-independence measures like they did in Massachusetts?
I'm not aware that they did.
Outside New England, there was much less local self-government.
Yeah. Oh. We have the town, town government in ways that it doesn't exist in the southern colonies.
Most of the country, the county is the, except for big cities, the main level of government below the states. In Massachusetts, in the last couple of 100 years, counties have not amounted to much.
But was there a similar call from the Continental Congress to, like, Virginia legislature or things like that to pass resolutions?
I'm not aware of any.
Well,
One more question. Why does New England have this local town? I mean, why? No, the other 13, the other colonies didn't. Why did they have this self-government in place? Where did that come from that the other colonies didn't have?
I think it comes from the Mayflower Compact. The Pilgrims, when they landed in Massachusetts, were lost. They were heading towards Virginia. That's where their land grant was in, actually in New York, I believe. And they were lost, and they were running out of beer, which sounds like
today.
they were running out of portable liquid. Is what they were.
If you sail, that's a bad thing.
Yeah. Because they couldn't, to drink water on board a ship would be not a good idea. So they needed to land to make more portable drinking fluid, and they realized that their charter didn't work any longer because they were not where they were supposed to be. So they were essentially in, again, a state of nature. They had no legal foundation for their being an organization. And so they create a temporary charter we call the Mayflower Compact, which is a temporary form of government. And they're basically doing this as they write to the king to grant them another charter. And from that moment on, we are self-governing in many ways.
The major population of Massachusetts comes from England in the 1630s, at a time when the people who left were thoroughly out of sympathy with the government of the Stuart monarchs at the time. And once a lot of them had gotten here, there was the English Civil War in the 1640s that the Puritans won. But the people in Massachusetts were essentially on their own for quite a while and determined to run things their way. From the point of view of the people back in England, practically everybody in New England was a non-conforming dissenter. That is, they wouldn't do the minimum that you had to do to be considered a reasonably member in good standing of the Church of England. The Church of England was the dominant religion down south for most of the colonial period, certainly in Virginia. That's much less true in the middle colonies, where you had a lot of Quakers and then a lot of German Protestants of different kinds. In Pennsylvania, Maryland was the one place where you could get away with being Catholic most of the time without much trouble, because the proprietor himself was Catholic. And the Stuart monarchs had been much more favorable to Catholicism than the Elizabeth beforehand and the people afterwards with William and Mary and so on. So, yeah, it's again complicated. And from the point of view of the governments and many of the rich people back in Europe, what's going on in the mainland of North America is less important than what's going on down in the Caribbean, because that's where they were making big money.
What was really pleasing to me is when everyone stood and took hands and pledged together. That must have taken amazing conversations. A lot of meetings and conversations and broken families and everything. And to contrast that with today, where it's best not to speak your politics. You know, I mean, Thanksgivings were canceled over the last 2 years. And that's within, family circles. So the fact that the conversations could be so widespread and so deep, to really put your your life and your family's life and your fortune on the line in this day and age is amazing.
If I may. Yeah.
I think it was amazing in their day and age.
Oh,
too.
there, yeah.
Yes, that last, the phrasing, in support of this declaration and pledging to each other lives, fortune, sacred honor, it was mentioned before that the declaration had no existing force of law behind it. And for the people who signed this in Philadelphia, these words definitely applied to them. And they wanted the words to apply to everyone. And these words are declaring that they admit that there is nothing else supporting this declaration except what they mutually pledged to do. And as far, they're going all in. It's independence or nothing.
Well, Ben Franklin, who was a late convert to independence, put it very well by saying, we must all hang together or we most assuredly will hang separately.
The decision to hold hands actually came spontaneously during our rehearsal. It's your idea, and it just seemed to kind of evolve naturally. I agree. It's a moving moment.
But I think it's an interesting point that you raise. That kind of, if you go back to the form of government taking place at that time in Massachusetts in particular, which was town meetings, and presumably there were active discussions and dialogues and arguments, and, kind of would be interesting, well, never knowing how good minutes are, right? But, how those were reported at the time of the level of passion or discourse that was taking place in real time, face to face with friends and neighbors and coworkers and people whose lives were fundamentally intermingled. And you kind of counteract that with how we communicate or fail to communicate today, right? Where so often political discourse can be single channel. It can be, outward directed, and you don't have to wait you can throw out your tweet and just don't listen to, see if you're retweeted or who tweets back. Or we can live in our entire bubble of like-minded people who affirm our views or our biases or whatever those might be. And I think that's, as I look at it, that's kind of a struggle that we face today. How do we return to create or somehow recreate or newly create the spaces for the types of discussions that were taking place, the things that have to happen to result in the ability to build a consensus or build a shared commitment to something at a time when it becomes so easy to just retreat. Yeah.
I don't know how free and open those town meetings were. Many of the opposing people had left. They were in Nova Scotia or in
That's
Great
what I was going
Britain.
to say. The Tories would have left because of the conflict. They would have probably been at town meetings and all of a sudden wound up saying, ooh, I'm going to get my business and myself out of here because there are more people on the rebel end.
There was a lot of rough stuff, and tarring and feathering, which did happen in New England, was no picnic.
I probably would have been one of those Tories because I do like my frippery. I liked my lace. I liked my tea. I wanted all the finer things. Probably I wasn't from Sudbury either. So as a Tory, I would have been long gone.
Some Tories also stayed.
Yes,
and
they did.
Some prospered after the war as well.
Yes.
There were militia units made up of Tories.
Yes,
There wore their green jackets.
Yep.
We've faced them on the reenactment battlefields.
Among other things, this is a civil war.
That's true. Yeah.
Much more in New York than in New England.
Yeah. A comment on the town meeting form of government and so on. Sudbury, of course, was founded by some of those nonconformists. My ancestors came to Sudbury in 1638, and they left England because they were attending a nonconformist church in England and were chastised by the archdeacon at Salisbury Cathedral. But if you want to read about the origins of at least the Massachusetts form of government and so on, read a book called Puritan Village by Sumner Chilton Powell. It actually was his thesis for a doctorate, I believe, at Harvard University. It won a Pulitzer Prize in 1963. It's about the settlers of Sudbury and what they had been in England and what they became, especially the leaders, in Sudbury when they settled the town in 1638. It's really a good read.
What's the name of it again?
Puritan Village, Sumner Chilton Powell, and it's available from Amazon, I'm sure, but it's available at the Sudbury Historical Society. They have a stock of them there. But you'll find the nonconformists, the people coming to New England, 20,000 of them, 20,000 nonconformists or Puritans came in the 1620s and 30s. Were here to get away from domination by the king and domination by the church in England. Both were factors in the formation, if you will, of the town meeting form of government for government and the congregational churches that were so important in New England.
Yes. I found the mention of the French in Quebec interesting. How far? How was there a clear delineation between New England and Canada at that point as a distinct colony? And
boy.
How did that begin?
And regions. There, throughout the 17th century, there is a large battle between the French Catholics and the English Protestants. And most of the Native American conflicts are embroiled in that same global kind of contest. So there's a distinct sense of those two regions. And there's a very high anti-Catholic sentiment throughout New England, which is part of when the Quebec Act is enacted. They're threatened by that because of that anti-Catholic sentiment.
And the Quebec Act also had part of it extended southward the territory of Quebec, so much so that it hemmed in western expansion of many of the colonies, which was another reason many of the colonies did not like the Quebec Act. And yes, I have to agree that there's always the tension between the French in Canada and the English, especially New England and New York. And it still plays out today, but instead of militia units fighting others and Native Americans, it seems to have settled down to a contest between Dunkin' Donuts and Tim Hortons.
Military service back then, was there a draft? Was it totally volunteer? Were you ostracized if you didn't let your son go be a militia? What was that like?
Well, in the 1600s, every man 16 years to 65 years of age was required to be a member of the local militia, ready to defend the town, and of course they did in King Philip's Wars in the mid-1600s. Some of them participated in the French and Indian Wars in the mid-1700s. That's where a lot of our military leadership came from, the men that had participated in those wars. At the time of the American Revolution, of course, there was no standing army. The country hadn't been formed yet, so of course there was no standing army. And all the fighting initially was done by militia units. When Congress finally came around to funding or authorizing, they didn't do very well at funding, the Continental Army, they at least had a standing army and you could sign up. But men signed up for 3 months, 6 months. They might sign up for the winter months when they weren't having to work their farms, and so on. And so
one of the other requirements.
And I don't think there was Yeah, you couldn't sign up if you didn't have two opposing teeth, because you had to be able to tear a cartridge open to load your musket. We love telling that to kids when we do demonstrations of our
The 7-year-olds.
Yeah. So, but you know, the men literally took short 3 months, 6 months assignments, and then went home.
And were pacifists part of this? Or
Not aware of what role. Or
I mean, Tories
how they were
left.
there. Yeah, the Tories.
Militias stepped forward. If someone decided this isn't for me, would they be tarred and feathered?
They were subject to investigation.
And fines.
There is also a quota, and there is somewhat of a draft. Each town has a quota that they need to send soldiers, and people could buy substitutes, and they would do that like they did during the Civil War as well.
But one of the complaints in the Declaration, right, wasn't that some of these folks are taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country. They were being drafted into the British Navy.
Yeah, impressment was
They're impressed.
very common in the British Navy, in Britain and in everywhere
Throughout-
they could get people.
throughout the empire. So, from the British point of view, they're not impressing Americans; they're impressing British citizens.
Yeah.
You could be tricked into being brought into the army. If you were drinking in a bar, a recruiter would put a coin in your mug, a king's coin, and at the end of your drink, if you took that coin and put it in your pocket, you had accepted pay from the king, and you were drafted into the army. That's why mugs started to have glass bottoms.
Any further comments or thoughts?
The thing that I'm taking away from tonight is I always thought it was the Stamp Act that got us all riled up, not the elimination of town meetings and all that. So it wasn't just a financial push.
It's a series of things. The Stamp Act starts them.
Yeah.
That's the beginning of it. And the Stamp Act is particularly unfortunate for England because it imposes the most penalties on printers. It will literally bankrupt them. And so they're the ones who have a voice, and they're the ones who fight it the most. I mean, there are many people who are fighting this, but unfortunately the people who have the means to communicate that grievance are impacted the most. And that begins us, that no taxation without representation comes from the Stamp Act crisis. And so that's the beginning of the imperial crisis, which becomes the American Revolution. So
the Stamp Act was repealed. At the time of the bicentennial of the American Revolution, I was teaching history at Wayland High. I wrote a revolutionary operetta using 18th century or older tunes. And we had, on one side of the ocean, the colonists joyfully singing, "Joy fills us all," to the tune of the original "Joy to the World. For word is come from Parliament and King, the Stamp Act is repealed, the breach with Britain healed, now let the welkin ring with praise of God and King. But on the other side is King George singing to the tune of God Save the King. This act of Parliament passed with our glad assent doth here declare we'll tax our colonies in any way we please to bring them to their knees and keep them there. That's the declaratory act. And King George personally, as things developed, insisted there must always be at least one tax to maintain the right of Parliament to tax the colonies. And that's why the Tea Act follows up on
the Township Acts that supposedly were just to regulate trade and so forth. And there was a colonial boycott, and they thought by making tea cheaper, the colonists would pay the tax on tea and so forth. And then the Boston Tea Party and the similar goings-on elsewhere. I didn't make kids memorize the dates. I made them memorize the order. That one thing led to the other and so forth, and the philosophy of the Declaration.
I'd just like to make an observation. I don't mean to make this sound too negative, but I just feel that in this whole evening that you mentioned some of the questions on the card here that are about is our country working? Are people free? Are any people not free? And I think it's been a very interesting discussion about the history and the social and political dynamics that brought about the American Revolution. But I'm a little distressed at the way in which this whole group just kind of bounced off of that discussion and got back into history. That's the safe place to be, So I'm just saying that. I think it would have been nice if we had been able to stick with some of these questions and really have the discussion that apparently that you would wanted to have.
Do you have anything to say about any of these questions?
I have lots to say about them, but it's a little late at this point. But I'll sum it up by saying a couple of things. I mean, one is that about this discussion of privilege is I didn't hear anything in the reading of the Declaration of Independence that charged the privileged with the responsibility to do anything about the welfare of those who were less privileged. Right? And
so where does that concept come from?
Well, I don't know, but it's a good
comes from Christianity, if nothing else.
I mean, it comes from Karl Marx too, but that didn't happen for quite a while.
Lots of people agree with that idea.
It also comes from maybe that sense of all men are created equal, that sense of equality?
In a way, but who are we really talking about when we were the authors of the Declaration, who were they really talking about when they said all men are created equal?
Mm-hmm. And who are we talking about when we talk about it?
Yeah, I think that in our day that we hopefully have a different concept of that. First of all, it's not just men, and secondly, it is people who are of all degrees of privilege and in all stations of life. Because that's the way I like to look at it. I really don't think that the authors of the Declaration were thinking of it that way.
No, in many ways, this is a corporate document. This is creating a political entity. It's Lincoln, not to make this another historical context, that changes the way we perceive this document to be about personal freedom and about slavery. And I think that's how we look at that phrase now. And then what does that imply that we need to do to create equality? So, I think when we ask the question here about the privilege should somehow support people, it's because we're envisioning, please say if you disagree with me, but we're envisioning a society of equality, and we're going to do everything we can to ensure or spread that equality. Does that resonate, or?
You mean that we today are envisioning that?
Yeah.
I think it's idealistic.
It's idealistic.
I always thought that the Declaration of Independence created the platform. Lincoln invited the people onto the platform. And it's our job now as American citizens, if we believe what has been written and lived, that we are to keep the door open and give the hand up to the platform. I don't feel that's happening now. I think there's a lot of not in my neighborhood, or I've got mine, screw you type thing. And I think that's where our civilization, our country is right now. People are hunkering down and protecting their own wealth, stuff, legacy, and not helping with the refugees or the undereducated or the people who need the leg up.
I thought the line about immigrants was interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's somewhat ironic that then and still how little of this is actually self-evident.
Well, and the phrasing is we hold the truths to be self-evident. You actually have to hold them. I like that. It's an active holding. And I like the holding of hands, too. I like that what the Franklin quote that you said, if we don't hang together, we surely hang separately. I mean, these folks represented by my colleagues in costume were literally risking their lives. If this didn't work, they would lose their lives, they would lose their property, and I feel like the same is true today. Maybe not as directly, but if we don't evolve into a culture where maybe people help up from the platform, maybe there just is no platform of true equality, we won't last.
Well, this morning I was watching CBS This Morning as I'm getting dressed, and the founder of Home Depot is releasing a book about capitalism is good. And he made the statement that the young people supporting Bernie Sanders are a bunch of losers because they've already given up. Instead of...
What have they given up?
They've given up their drive to succeed. They want a handout. And I was shocked that that was his interpretation of people getting involved with civics and wanting a more equal path for people. The dividing walls of wealth and education are still very much alive in this country, and it's divisive and punishing, I think.
He happens to be in the top 10 Republican donors list.
I'm sure.
By the way.
I'm sure. He's at a talk in a book.
In regards to protesting, and then and now, there were people in England at the time of the Revolution who admitted that some of the causes of the upstarts and radicals of the Americas had a point, but they were going about protesting it the wrong way. What? That there should be more petitions and there should be more entreaties.
Seriously?
And we have the same problem today, that if very often there are some people who don't like a protest, but rather than saying they don't like the protest, they say they don't like the manner of the protest they're using. And we are stuck with the same problems today that we had then.
What is the method we should employ? You raised at the end, if our government is not essentially serving us the way we want it to, what's our redress?
Wasn't the all men are created equal part of the old Republican Party that Jefferson's vision, I thought, was that the government would be run by us, the common people, not women at that time, but and so to bring it to today's time, obviously getting people to go out and vote for candidates who stand for what the platforms are that they want to have happen in our country. So if the Bernie supporters were unhappy with the way the Democratic
party played the game to get Hillary to be elected and not showing up to vote, I think that they need to, I think they are moving beyond that. I think this whole indivisible group is the outreach from that sort of defeat. So there is hope to me.
But I think that Congress is defined as coming together. And I think there are some people in Congress now who think that they have tenure and they have the right to be there, and they don't have to talk across the aisle. And they've lost the discourse, they've lost the face-to-face, they've lost everything that got these people to where they could stand up and pledge their life to a country. You know?
Well, you look at everything from gerrymandering to, you even look at the bare minimums of what it costs to run for a seat in Congress. You know, if you don't have multiple of millions in the bank, you don't necessarily have a chance of even making it to a short list of primary candidates. Then I think, you know, there's a lot of people who would self-identify regardless of, you know, who knows what the numbers are, right? But everything that talks about primaries goes to show that primaries tend to favor the most extreme candidates of either side of a party, which then oftentimes makes it very difficult for a general population when it comes to a general election, right? And so, you know, I do think that there become these questions, and going back to as we thought about how the government was supposed to be, citizen politicians, right? You know, the idea was that it didn't necessarily have to be a full-time job. You look at local governments; it's volunteers to be on a local board of selectmen. That was sort of the mentality that was going to sort of ladder up. Now, I mean, the professionalism of campaigning, the professionalism of staff. Look at something like a piece of healthcare legislation with 864 pages. How many of us think that any single member of Congress read it? Right? You know, and even of their paid professional staff, how many of those staff members read it based rather than depending upon, you know, industry professionals, aka lobbyists of one stripe or another, to help digest it? I mean, and that's, you know, as somebody who's, you know, political scientist major going through it, worked for the federal government, you sort of see this and you kind of think, God, like, how do you deconstruct this back down in such a way that you kind of get back to elements of dialogue, of representation, of feeling truly encumbered by the responsibility of being a representative of the people that you are there to do? I don't know.
A friend of mine from Germany, excuse me, because it's right to this point, a friend of mine from Germany was in the Bundestag, the parliament, for 38 years, I believe, or something like that. They can't start politicking, running for office, until something like 6 weeks ahead of the election.
Perfect.
Yep.
Wonderful.
So it isn't, you know, in the United States, they start the day after they've been elected. They start running for the office the next time.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming. Take care, folks.
Thank you all for this. I think it is time for us to wrap up, and I think we'd like to do that by singing a song.
Okay, I'll just make a little comment about music or the songs that were popular in this area in the during the Revolutionary War period and pre-Revolutionary War period. First of all, in the 18th century, songs were often used as a form of social media to share and spread political ideas and propaganda, as well as to entertain. The writer would take a well-known tune, like the British Grenadiers, various other tunes, and they would write new lyrics. And then these would be published in newspapers and broadsides, usually accompanied by the phrase, "a new song to the tune of." And then the opposing side would take the same tune and write a rebuttal. And then the first one would write another one, and it would go back and forth, sometimes many, many sets of lyrics to this one tune. Anyways, we're going to do just one song because it's getting late.
Yes.
So it's Free American. I'll let Claire.
Right. We
describe
invite
that.
you to join us in singing this. The lyrics are on the sheet on your seat.
And this song is entitled Free America. The lyrics of Free America are attributed to Dr. Joseph Warren, a central figure in Boston's revolutionary agitation who died at the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775. This version was published in the Massachusetts Spy in May of 1774 to the tune of another well-known song, The British Grenadiers. That seat of science, Athens, and its proud mistress Rome, where now are all their glories, we scarce can find their tomb. Then guard your rights, Americans, nor stoop to lawless sway. Oppose, 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 oppose for North America. We left their freedom hither, and lo, the desert smiled. A paradise of pleasure now opened in the wild. Your hearts cold, Americans, no power shall snatch away. Preserve, preserve, preserve your rights in free America. Torn from a world of tyrants beneath this western sky, we formed a new dominion, a land of liberty. The world shall know we're free men here, and such will ever be. Huzzah, 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 huzzah for love and liberty. Lift up your hearts, my heroes, and swear with proud disdain. The wretch that would ensnare you shall spread his net in vain. Should Europe empty all her force, we'll meet them in array, and shout huzzah, huzzah, huzzah for brave America. The land where freedom reigns shall be masters of the main, in giving laws and freedom to subject France and Spain. And all the isles or oceans spread shall tremble and obey the prince who rules by freedom's laws in North America. Huzzah!
Thank you all for coming.
Okay. Discussion.
Pleasure, sir. This is my wife, by the way.
Hi, good job. Lovely. Thank you. I'm Chris's wife. I saw that in your email. I know, I was like, wow.